Hi guys, this is me coming in for the video that we had planned for today. I know it's a little later, but this video is honestly, it's a little bit of a short topic, so I figured it could be done a little later than usual, so it shouldn't take all that long compared to some other topics that we will be doing or we have done. Today's topic is basically kind of one of those historical event dates, and it was on this date, on March 30th of 1981, that President Ronald Reagan was shot in an attempted assassination by John Hinckley Jr. Now, of course, as we all know, Reagan survived this. In fact, to my knowledge, he's the only president to have been shot in an assassination attempt and survived. Now, there have been other assassination attempts on presidents, but none that actually ended up with the president being shot and surviving. So Reagan is the first and only so far to have to do this, and hopefully it don't happen again. So I guess we're not really going to do much here on formalities and stuff. We're just going to hop right into it to get this done. So we will go into this again with the handy dandy notebook that we always have. Anyway, just to give a little background for Reagan, of course, we'll go through that. President Ronald Reagan was elected president in the election of 1980. He beat Democratic incumbent President Jimmy Carter in the 1980 general election in the United States. He took office on January 20th of 1981 of the same year that he was actually got shot. And Reagan was, of course, at the time, the oldest president ever elected. He was age 69 when he got elected. His birthday was in February, so by the time he got shot, he was actually 70. And he held this record until the election in 2016 of Donald Trump, who was 70 at the time of his election. So Trump has now got the record of oldest president elected, which is kind of odd. And then also, as we probably all know, Reagan was a former, very popular former Hollywood actor who had starred in a lot of movies back in the day, and that was where he met his wife, Nancy Davis, who was actually his second wife. He had a first wife named Jane Wyman, but she kind of divorced him, and then he found her, and they lived very many years happily together. And he had been not only this actor in Hollywood, but from roughly until 1975. I think 1968 to 1975. I could be wrong on the start year. He was also the governor of California. Basically, as we all kind of also, maybe if you've ever seen a video of Reagan, he always had a very open, welcoming, and pleasant personality to him. He was even humorous at times. He's honestly, in my opinion, probably one of our best presidents that we've had since post-World War II. He's probably been one of our best ones, in terms of not only his success, but in terms of his personality and his connection with the American people. So that is just a little thing on him. So let's hop right to the assassination day here. On March 30th of 1981, President Reagan was delivering an address at a labor meeting speech, or whatever you want to call this, a labor union meeting, at the Washington Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. He was just delivering an address to this assembled meeting before it would officially begin. After his address was done, Reagan and his entourage of Secret Service agents, police officers, and his press secretary exited the building. They exited the building, and they went out through the lobby, and they were walking along the sidewalk to get to the presidential limousine, and he was going to go back to the White House for the day. Well, as they were exiting the building, there was a crowd of people here, all assembled all along the sidewalk. All along the sidewalk, there were just these bystanders, people that just wanted to say hi or greet or see the president. And of course, they were trying to get his attention and everything. And you can even see in the assassination video that Reagan kind of had his good nature kick in, and he was waving to them and making small jokes. At times, he was acknowledging them. Well, in this crowd of bystanders, I guess is what you would call it, we had a very disgruntled 25-year-old under the name, he was named John Hinckley Jr. Now, we'll get further into how he did this further on, but we're just going to cut to what he did, and he pulled out a .22 caliber revolver and proceeded to fire 6 shots at Reagan. And when I say fire 6 shots, I mean it is kind of shocking. I will, after this video, either in this video or on the page's links page, I will post the actual assassination video that got recorded of when this happened. But it's just kind of silence almost. There's people waving to him, and all of a sudden, it's like out of nowhere, there are successive shots. Hinckley wasted no time. It's just talking, and all of a sudden, you hear this. I don't know how many claps that was, but that gives you an explanation like that. They were successive. They weren't drawn out. Hinckley was just taking the best of it and shooting. Well, in these shots, immediately, of course, Hinckley was tackled to the ground and pinned to a wall by police officers. But in the process of these shots, Press Secretary James Brady, who was with Reagan at the time, he was hit right in the head. He fell down to the ground. He was critically injured. And Secret Service agent Timothy McCarthy and policeman Thomas Delahanty were also shot. Delahanty got hit in the neck, and McCarthy was hit in his side. Now, as for Reagan, as soon as the shots rang out, there was a Secret Service agent right behind him, and his name was Jerry Parr. And Parr, as soon as he heard the shots ring out, of course, their Secret Service training kind of kicked in there, like, okay, protect the president. And they were less than 2 feet away from the open door of the limousine, and Parr shoved Reagan into the limousine, trying to get him out of the way. What Parr and Reagan both didn't know at the time, and there was no way they could have known, was that by pushing Reagan into the vehicle, he actually pushed him into the path of a ricocheting bullet. One of the bullets that Hinckley had, out of the 6 bullets that Hinckley had fired, one had gone and hit the limousine and ricocheted off it. And when Parr pushed Reagan into the limousine, he pushed him right into the path that this bullet went into Reagan's chest. Of course, at the time, neither of them knew it. No one knew it. Well, of course, the limousine, as Hinckley is now pinned against the wall, the first instinct is get the president out of there. So they take Reagan's limousine, close the door, drive off, and he's still got Reagan kind of pinned to the seat of the limousine in the back. He's not letting them up until they're a couple blocks away. And Parr finally lets Reagan get up, and he sits up. They both sit up in the back seat, and of course they say, okay, get back to the White House. Let's get him back there. He don't look like he got hurt. Well, as they're driving to the White House, Reagan starts coughing a little bit, and eventually he asks Parr for a tissue, and when he takes the tissue away, there's blood in the tissue, and that kind of signals to Parr, okay, something's wrong. Of course, Parr didn't exactly know he'd been hit either still. They still didn't think he'd really been hit. They actually thought, well, maybe Parr thought that, well, I did shove him in there pretty hard. He's 70 years old. Maybe I broke a rib or something when I shoved him. So, still not realizing it was a bullet, he still did the life-saving maneuver that all experts have mostly agreed upon, kind of saved Reagan's life, and that was that he immediately ordered the driver to, instead of heading to the White House, to immediately make a detour and head to George Washington University Hospital, which was down the road. When they got there, Reagan insisted on walking into the emergency room on his own will. So he didn't have no wheelchair, he didn't have no cane, he didn't have no one helping him in, and he got about 3 or 5 steps through the door, and he collapsed into the floor, and they had to take him off in the gurney and everything else, like rather quickly, of course, because of course this is the President of the United States. You're not going to mope around here. Well, once they got to the room, the doctors kind of took x-rays immediately as quick as they could, and it kind of became evident through the x-rays of what had happened, and that they discovered Reagan had a bullet lodged in his left lung, and he was suffering from a collapsed left lung. His left lung had been pierced by a bullet. But the bad thing was, and lucky thing, was this bullet came to rest about 1 inch away from Reagan's heart. If it had been just a little closer, he would have had his heart hit, and he would have been dead instantly. So it was kind of beneficial. It didn't, but it also made the operation trickier because we got to be careful when we remove this thing. because we're operating so closely to his heart that it could lodge into there and kill him. As Reagan was being, of course, they go into emergency surgery because this is the President of the United States. This is like your highest priority. Reagan was still conscious, and he was even in good spirits. He really wasn't negative or anything, or even sad or scared about this, really. He was even making jokes, being his good, affable, humorable nature. And his wife, Nancy, was told she got transported immediately from the White House, and she was brought into the operations room before he was be sent to surgery. And as he met with Nancy, he made the humorous joke of, "Honey, I forgot to duck." And then he even continued this as the surgeons were taking him to the operating room just before they administered put him to sleep a little bit, put him under medicine, that way he'd be asleep during the surgery, amnesia or whatever you want to call it. I don't know exactly what the technical term is for it. But anyway, before they did this, he was still conscious in the surgery room, and he's looking up at all the surgeons, and they asked him, "Are you uncomfortable, Mr. President?" And Reagan just makes the comment, "Well, I don't know. Well, I guess I might be a little bit. I mean, I hope that you're all Republicans." And the surgeons all were laughing, of course, and the head doctor or surgeonist or whatever you will call him, he made the comment, and he said, "Mr. President, today we're all Republicans." So even in the brink of what could have been his death, Reagan was still in good spirits. He was still being humorable. He was still being himself. He wasn't showing that fear. The surgery took about 2 hours, and the doctors successfully did remove the bullet. And Reagan, of course, was declared that he was going to be okay. He was going to recover. He was going to be just fine, thus saving his life. The surgery, basically, it was done on that very day. But the doctors, of course, because Reagan was 70 years old, they wanted to keep him for about a week under observation just to be safe. I mean, he is 70 years old. They didn't know if he was going to have a complication from the surgery or not, so just to play on the safe side, they wanted to do that. And so for the next following week, Reagan did spend the entire week in the hospital, just under observation. And while he was there, of course, he wanted to get to work. He's like, "I gotta to do my job, and I've not been in office for maybe 2 months, a little over 2 months, and I can't do nothing." So he demanded, there was a piece of legislation. I don't know exactly what the legislation was. I'm sure you can look it up. I mean, I really couldn't find it on my own. Anyway, it was delivered to the White House, and they said, "Well, you can sign it when you get out of the hospital." And Reagan's like, "No, I want to do something now. I need to show the American people I'm going to do my job, even if I'm sitting here." And he had them bring the legislation over, and he signed it into law on his hospital bed. He was a man that he's like, "I don't care if I'm the better or not, I'm working." I wish I could do that. Well, anyway, after about a week, Reagan was released. This was on April 11th. Reagan was released, and he went home to the White House. And as he was exiting the White House, there was a very popular video of, well, not as he's exiting the White House, but as he arrives at the White House, just before he gets in, as he's exiting the limousine, one of the news reporters that's taking photos, they asked Reagan, he's like, "Mr. President, what are you going to do when you get home?" And his first saying is this. He's like, "Sit down." Nice way to put it, Ronnie. But basically, by April 11th, he was released, and he was back home. The ordeal was over. It had been frightening, though, because remember, this was actually captured on multiple news channels that actually captured the assassination in person and live, and it was kind of shocking, and people feared, well, it's now been roughly 20 years since almost 20 years since John F. Kennedy was killed, because if you ever look back at U.S. history, and I can do a separate video on this at some other point, almost every president that has either died, every president who has either died in office or been assassinated, except for one, which was Zachary Taylor, the 12th president, but every other one other than him, there's at least almost a 20-year period between each one. Like, for example, 20 years before Abraham Lincoln, you had 1845. Well, in 1841, remember, I said around 20. It's not quite in all cases. In 1841, President William Henry Harrison was in office for a month, and he died of pneumonia. He was the first one to die in office. And then roughly a little over 20 years later, Abraham Lincoln shot. Roughly 20 years later, in 1881, a little less than 20 years, James A. Garfield was shot and assassinated. Take 20 years exactly after that, in 1901, and William McKinley is shot and assassinated. 20 years after that, in 1921, oh, 1920 is 1921, but in 1923, Warren G. Harding died in office. 20 years after that, 1943, in 1945, Franklin Roosevelt dies in office. 20 years after that, 18 years after that, I should say, John F. Kennedy is shot and killed. And now here it is, 18 years after that, and Ronald Reagan has been shot and killed. So people feared that he was going to die, and there was very much relief when he did not. So it was very happy for the people here in the United States. Basically, that was what happened there. Now, after this assassination attempt, Reagan's popularity greatly soared with the American people, and he even gained a lot of support in Congress, and he was welcomed as a hero when he did his speech here, which we're going to mention in a minute. And basically, he had been pressing when he got run for re-election. He wanted, the economy was somewhat going downhill, and Reagan had a very controversial economic plan to kind of help that, and it needed the support of some Democrats to kind of come to the Republican side in order to pass it. And until then, that had not happened. Well, after this happened, there was more than enough support for Reagan that some Democrats did break away from their main party, join with the Republicans, and in August of 1981, his economic plan package was approved and passed and made into law. On April 28th, Reagan was invited by Congress to make a special do a special address before Congress, which would be addressed to them and the American people in general. And basically, during this thing, he was basically just thanking everyone in Congress and thanking the American people as well for all the kindness, love, and support that they had shown him and Nancy and their family during this crisis, and to those others who had also been shot, who we'll get to here shortly. Now, during this one, it was just a wonderful message, just thanking everyone. Reagan very much came to believe in his own mind, and he stated this throughout the later part of his presidency, that he thought that God had spared his life because it wasn't his time to go yet. There was something he had to do that God wanted him to do, and God had spared it for some reason. And he believed this till the very day that he died, that his life had been spared that way. And honestly, I think that is very much possible, as I'm Christian myself. And if we're not going to get too much in the religious aspects here, so I'll leave it at that, I guess. But basically, if you're Christian, you can kind of see where that might be possible. And then during this thing that he did, during this address, Reagan definitely made everyone laugh, I guess, because he had received numerous letters from multiple people, and he chose to read one letter during this address. There was one letter that he chose to read, and it was from a young second grader named Peter Sweeney. And when he was reading this little letter that Peter had wrote him, of course, he was in second grade. He was just concerned for the president, and he was writing him a get well card, basically, essentially, what a little kid would write. And what was funny and made everyone laugh in Congress and everyone that ever watches this video, and I'll actually try to include that in the video too so you can see this. Apparently, Peter wrote in this note as Reagan announced it, and it's kind of touching and heartwarming as it is funny. He said, "Well, I hope you get well soon, or you might have to make a speech in your pajamas." It was funny, so I will definitely show that in one of the links that I'll provide here. And basically, that was for Reagan. That was mostly it there. Now, as for Hinckley, our wonderful would-be assassin, who ultimately failed, as I mentioned, Hinckley is only 25 years old. He's very young, but he's not exactly a minor. I mean, he's definitely over that stage, so he could be killed, executed, if determined by a court. And Hinckley was arrested on that very day by the D.C. police, and he was charged, of course, with attempting to assassinate the president, which in this country is probably one of the worst offenses you can possibly do. Excuse me. Basically, The trial was held off, and in June of 1982, the trial began, and Hinckley was found in June of 1982 at his trial. He was basically found to be not guilty. I repeat, not guilty by reason of insanity. This is the first time a presidential assassin didn't get basically the death penalty wiped on their heads. Every other one had either been chased down in a manhunt, such as John Wilkes Booth, who we all know, that wonderful little character, who we'll actually discuss here in a few weeks, approximately about 2 weeks, but we'll get into them then. Who I just love mustache freaking assassins. They think they're so smart, and then they're so dumb. Anyway, but we'll get that later. Anyway, Hinckley, for the first time, a would-be presidential assassin was found not guilty, because of insanity. Now, you might think, well, how is this guy insane? Oh, even I think he was insane, given what we kind of know now. And this was provided by his lawyers at his trial. At the trial, Hinckley's lawyers argued that Hinckley had a narcissistic personality disorder. He basically was mentally deranged. And they cited medical evidence to support their claim, which was valid, that Hinckley did seem to have a mental condition throughout his life, and that it was also revealed at this trial that Hinckley had an obsession with actress Jodie Foster. Now, I don't know if you really hear about her much today, but back then she was kind of a big deal. And he basically became obsessed with her after witnessing her performance in the 1976 film Taxi Driver. And Hinckley was so obsessed with Foster, this actress, that he had never really met. She didn't know him. He was a common man, and she's an actress. He had no way he was ever going to meet her, really. She knew nothing of him. She knew nothing of him. He knew nothing of her other than what he had seen in a movie. Let's just make that clear. There was no connection between them either. They didn't even know each other. But he had such an obsession with Jodie Foster that Hinckley believed that if he assassinated the president, he would gain her attention. John, I believe you may have gained attention by her, but not in the good fashion. I know what you're probably aiming for. That's not the way to go it, buddy. And even then, get away, you're not my buddy. Hinckley, basically, that was his excuse, and it became later known that, yes, that what kind of was the truth, and this was determined to be true. So they did say, yeah, he's not guilty because he's just insane. He's a nutcase. Hinckley was, however, although he was basically determined to be not guilty, Hinckley was placed into St. Elizabeth's Hospital for his mental condition. It was a mental hospital, basically. He was confined to that for the coming years, and we'll get on to what happened here in a minute. I just wanted to mention what happened to Reagan and what happened to the others that got shot. As for Reagan, here, if I look, well, I can cite this, of course. Reagan, eventually, he did complete his first term. He won a second term as president. He helped end the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and eventually the Soviet Union collapsed shortly after he left office. So that's largely attributed to him and his vice president, George H.W. Bush, who later became the 41st president right after Reagan. And basically, Reagan he left office in 1989. Now, in 1994, Reagan was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. He basically wrote a address to everyone in America just to let them know what had happened and that he very much enjoyed their support and their love, and he stated that he was heading toward the sunset of his life, or something in that regard. I've heard it before. I haven't looked at it recently, so I could be wrong in how he worded it. I do apologize if I did. And basically, he relived the rest of his life in more of an isolation kind of feel with his wife, Nancy, until his death in June of 2004. As for the others that got shot, policeman Delahanty, I think that was his name, right? Yeah, policeman Delahanty and Secret Service agent Timothy McCarthy were both they both recovered. They both were fine. They went back to their respective jobs. But as for James Brady, he kind of got the worst end out of any of this, really. And remember, he had actually got shot in the head. It actually went through his eye. He went flat on the ground as soon as he got the bullet, and he wasn't good. Now, he did survive. Brady did survive. And unfortunately for him and his family, he did suffer permanent brain damage from the shot. That basically it left him paralyzed, partially paralyzed for the rest of his life. He was in a wheelchair for the rest of his life because he was partially paralyzed. And that happened to him. He died a couple of years ago, I think, or so. And they actually ruled it was a homicide. It constituted as a homicide, they ruled, because of the factor that his death had directly been caused by the effects of what had happened when his brain got shot, basically. So that was bad for him. As for Hinckley, here as we come to the end of the video, Hinckley, in the late 1990s, Hinckley's lawyer argued that his mental illness was in remission and that Hinckley should be allowed to return to a normal life as a normal person. I don't know about you, but in my opinion, if you tried to shoot the President of the United States, I don't care if you're insane or not, I don't want you on the street. Because if you got the guts to go after the President of the United States, you got about the guts to go after about anybody. But regardless of this, the judges did rule that Hinckley was allowed to have supervised day trips off the hospital grounds, off St. Elizabeth's, that he could, as long as they were supervised, he had to be with somebody. And he was allowed to have unsupervised visits with his parents. However, during these visits with his parents, although there was no one actually in the room with them, he was being secretly monitored by the Secret Service, who would voluntarily agreed to secretly monitor him while he was on these visits without Hinckley really knowing. And finally, the last piece of information here, and this may scare you a little bit, I don't know. Hinckley was released to live with his mother in 2016. Now, his dad died sometime in the time since the assassination, but his mother's still alive, and he was released to live with his mother, who lived in Williamsburg, Virginia, who still does to this day. And in 2018, 2 years ago, Hinckley was basically given permission after a judge ruled that Hinckley could live within 75 miles of his home in Williamsburg, Virginia, as long as he meets regularly with his psychiatrist and his social worker, among other conditions that were listed, but I'm not going to go into detail what the other ones were, but those are the two primary ones. So as of right now, John Hinckley Jr. is a semi-independent free man, not entirely, but he's still restricted to living within 75 miles of Williamsburg, Virginia, and he is out. I mean, he's not in a hospital, but they say that he has changed since then, and he's got under control whatever mental condition he had here. But in my opinion, I think they should have kept him locked up, given what he did. I don't think I would have let a nutcase like that out, but that's my opinion. I mean, I'm not in charge here or nothing like that. So that basically confers for this small little video. As I mentioned, it was going to be shorter than what we're used to on that. So that is it for the assassination attempt of Ronald Reagan in March of 1981. Now, as for our next video this week, I will be doing one on April 2nd, which is Thursday, on the fall of Richmond, Virginia, / the end of the siege of Petersburg on April 2nd of 1865, in which we'll just kind of go into the fact that, although it happened like a week later, we'll go into the fact that the Union entering Richmond and everything else, as the South kind of finally lost the Civil War, although this is like a week or two before General Lee was going to surrender at Appomattox. This basically signaled we're at the end of the Civil War, because now the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia has finally fallen. The Confederate government is in flight, and the war's an end. And unfortunately, before Appomattox was going to happen, well, actually, just after Appomattox happened, very unfortunately, Lincoln got shot, which we will cover, of course, here in about 2 weeks. So that will be the gist of this week's video, is the fall of Richmond, Virginia during the American Civil War as the war came to a close. So that's all for this video. Be sure to like or subscribe in the comments below. Be sure to list any topics that you may have as usual. So that's it for all this, and hopefully everyone has a good night, and hope to see you here on Thursday.